The challenge of finding a safe, affordable place to live has become a stark reality for many South African students. Protests have erupted over the chronic shortage of student accommodation on campuses across the country since the start of the year. Some students are squatting in vacant buildings, while others sleep in lecture halls, an unacceptable norm in a democracy. Activists are sounding the alarm. This isn't just a housing crisis, they say, it's a denial of the right to education. Vezinhlanhla Simelane joins me now. Vezi, thanks so much for taking time. Now, it's 2025 and we still see images of students sleeping in libraries. Why should the public still have faith in the education system?
Thanks. Thank you very much, and good day to you and good day to our viewers at home. I must say that as a former student activist, it's good to be back here so that we are able also to contribute in terms of higher education. The situation that we find ourselves in, our students find themselves in, it's a long-standing problem that even when we're in the student movement, South African Student Congress, we raised that there is a crisis of accommodation in this country. So we needed to find a permanent solution. And part of the thing that we raised with the government was that they must be able to ensure that they give us or they give students the properties that are no longer used for anything in government. Take those properties, give it to Minister of Higher Education or the department, so that government can have its own capacity. Because at first, what we have said is that more than anything else, government must be able to build state capacity. On the side of student accommodation, there must be more residences for our students. But in an environment where both building takes time, they must be able to ensure that there are many properties that fall under public works that are not used currently. I listened to the president at some point when he was speaking about the expropriation bill, that some of the properties in Johannesburg must be taken and government must be able to utilize them for whatever services that they are doing. So that's the very same thing that when they expropriate those properties, they must look into the crisis of accommodation, take them, convert them to return accommodation, so that you don't want to find a situation where I've seen some article, I think in New City, in one of the universities in Cape Town, where students have been chased out, they don't have accommodation, all of that. So we must not treat this as not an urgent issue that must be dealt with. For the past years that we've been involved, the same problem were existing, and even today, the same problem are still existing. We are urging the student formations where we are coming from SASCO to continue to fight to ensure that the issue is addressed permanently. Last time we checked, is that there was a shortage of over 500,000 beds in this country for both university students and TVET colleges, and we didn't have a concrete plan to say how can we address this with this particular matter. So we believe that government must be able to pay attention to this thing, because it's deprived our students the right to access education and all of those things. Because when you speak about a conducive environment in the higher education sector for the student, we cannot take away the part of accommodation, because for you to be able to focus on your studies, you must be able to have shelter, proper shelter, so that you are able to pay attention to your studies. Remember, this thing has an impact also on their performance, because if you poor perform, NSFAS, somehow we are unable to be assisted by NSFAS because we are not doing well academically. So it does a lot of challenges, anxiety, depression, and all of those things. So we believe that stakeholders in the higher education sector must be able to sit down again and find a permanent solution. But for ourselves, we still believe that public works and other unused properties of government must be able to be used here in this instance for a solution. And in that, I think it will be halfway the problem that we are facing currently.
It obviously raises a question about capacity within government, or more importantly, the absence of political will. But you've touched a little bit, Vesi, on how these students are potentially dealing with the challenge. But when you live or are having to squat in vacant buildings, sleeping in lecture halls, what does this do to your morale? What does this do to the confidence of a young person who's potentially in university or a TVET college in the first year and trying to make their way through the system?
Mental health is one of the challenges that those people will be facing, because as I was saying that as when we're involved in SARS, one of the slogans that we have always said is that we must ensure that our students, they succeed. But for you to be able to succeed when you're a university student or a TV student, the environment must be conducive. So what do we mean when we say the environment must be conducive? We are saying that students must be able to have access to meals so that they can be able to have energy and focus. That is why we've always, in our times, fought for the increase of meal allowances, to standardize meal allowances for TVET students and university students. We must have access to accommodation. We must have access to book. That is why there's book allowance. There's meal allowance, there's accommodation allowance, there's book allowance. All those things combined, they are able to assist a particular student to pay attention to their studies so that they can be able to finish in time, so that they are not dropped by NSFAS in the process. Because remember, NSFAS now, there's a rule that was introduced, N+1. It says a duration of your qualification. If it's a 4-year program, a 3-year program, you do it, but there's N+1 in an environment where you didn't perform in a particular year. The year can be added so that at least you are able to finish your qualification. But I can tell you, with our experience, is that students who don't have accommodation, who stays in checks because there's a shortage of accommodation, they ended up not doing well because they don't have proper shelter. They are unable to study for their examination. There's no way that you are going to focus. So this on its own takes back the government, the good thing that the government has been able to do. Because if you are saying we are going to give fund, I was told this year they funded over 1.2 million students funded by NSFAS, which is a good thing. So it must not end there to say we're funded over this number of students. But then what also do you do to ensure that the environment is conducive for them to finish? Because if you have funded a particular number, remember there are those who are doing grade 12 this year who are supposed to enter into the system next year. So you must ensure that when you have funded 1 million students, the next generation must be able to benefit in that. You don't want people to say this is the amount of money that government has produced, but when you check the output, the very minimal number of people who have been able to finish their qualifications. And when you go deeper to the problem to say what is the main challenge, you realize that one of the factors is student accommodation. One of the factors that we have seen also is that there is a new challenge now. People who have accommodation, private landlords, they are now making this thing as to maximize their profit. You'll have NSFAS on the side saying that this is the capping amount for student accommodation. And then on the other side, landlords are costing exorbitant amount of money because they see that there's now some lucrativeness in this thing. We called on government to standardize the pricing on accommodation. At some point, we even tried to call the Competition Commission to say they must come on board to regulate this thing of student accommodation. I know for a fact in UKZN, the people, even though we're still outside, we're no longer in the student movement, but people, they still come to us and saying, how do we do here? A person who have applied for NSFAS and get approved, you will not be approved by NSFAS because if you are coming from a well background, we are approved by NSFAS because we don't have money to study. Now, when we are saying NSFAS gives you 50,000 for accommodation annually, but people who own properties, they are saying, now we're going to charge you 70,000 per student annually. So there's a shortage of 20,000. So what happens is that when they are registered, there's that debt. NSFAS pays an amount, 20,000, they don't pay. The following year, I can tell you now, the following year, there are a number of students today who are unable to register. But when they go to a university, the university says, you owe us this amount of money, but for you to be able to register, must settle this amount of money. Remember, this person is an NSFAS student. He has passed all the modules, but there's this shortfall that they've never created. They ended up not registering. As I'm speaking to you now, there are people who are out of the system because of that reality. So there are many factors when it comes to student accommodation. And I think stakeholders must sit down and standardize the price. But you are going to address it if ever government, as I said initially, if ever government is in the path of ensuring that we build more state capacity so that we run away from people who are taking advantage of our vulnerable students and all of those things. So we are still confident that the leadership that we have in government, and they must be able to have a political will, listen to different voices, the contributions, because it doesn't mean that when we're a leader of a particular organization or in government, we have all the wisdom. That is why we have different stakeholders who must add their views, who must ensure that at least the solution is the solution that is going to address the crisis that we are facing. It's very painful to see what we are seeing today, and we are hoping that a solution will be found in that regard.
Now, how are students organising themselves to fight for safe housing? And are they being heard by the Education Ministry? Obviously, I mean, you've been in the system, you're out of the system. It's been a few years, and the very same problems that you encountered when you were a student and also part of the student movement still exist. In fact, are worsening to some extent.
What I can say with our experience is that the struggle continues. The struggle continues. Those who are affected by the question of that we are discussing now of accommodation, and the leadership of the various student formation must be able to continue the struggle, because what I can say is that our generation, during our time, there was a particular struggle that, in my view, was a primary struggle, the question of fees. You remember, that particular struggle was somehow we were able to win the struggle as a generation. But it didn't mean that the accommodation question was not a primary issue even at that time. But I can tell you now that at least now the discussion of fees, because NSFAS is no longer a loan how it used to be. It's now a pasar and all of those things. So that struggle on its own, even though at some point there were many people who didn't believe that we can be able to achieve that particular issue, but we did achieve because there was pressure from ourselves as students, and we made society even to accept that indeed this particular struggle is an important struggle that must be supported by society, not only students, because before we were students, we were coming from communities, we were coming from families where if ever we're having a particular problem at our campuses, somehow they're also affected. So even this one of accommodation, what I can say is that the struggle continues. They must fight. They must not only engage government, they must also engage civil society, other organizations, so that when there is pressure put on government, at least everyone is able to understand what is exactly that they are dealing with. So my view is that the fight must continue, the struggle continues. So every generation has their own struggle that they must be able to fulfill. So in this regard, I do believe that at the center of this thing, at the level of student accommodation is one of the important struggles that our leaders must be able to wait and focus, so that the next generation can also focus on their struggles as well.
Vezinhlanhla Simelane, student activist, speaking to us on students still facing major accommodation crisis, with some sleeping in disused buildings and hallways. And he says the struggle must continue.